our lesson tonight, I come this evening with a little bit of a struggle because we are getting further into more modern history. We are going to be into all the way into the 1700s by the time we finish tonight. And there's a couple of things that I struggle with is that every time I teach, whether I'm teaching from Scripture or whether I'm teaching something like this, is like, oh, I don't want to leave that out. Oh, I don't want to leave that out. Not only do I not want to leave that out, but I feel like I will be neglectful if I leave that out. And so part of my struggle is there's like so much of church history that I'm like, oh, that's irresponsible if I leave that out. Or, oh, there's some things tonight we're going to get to Baptists. And I'm like, oh, if I leave that out, I'm not telling the whole story. And so I'm struggling over that. But I have to remember that the point of this is I didn't do anything over here. The point of this is to teach the history of denominations. It's not Baptist history. It's not church history. We are still trying to just focus on specific areas. And so I have to be careful that I don't just dive too deep or too wide in one spot so that we can keep the story moving. But there's stuff that I want to tell you about. There's stuff that we want to talk about. So if you don't mind staying till 8:15, we will be good this evening. Simple solution. So the question that we get to this evening is, where do Baptists come from? It almost feels like it's the beginning of a punchline, but here's the question. Where do Baptists come from? Some of that question is well, it depends on what a Baptist is. Because there's multiple definitions of what it means to be a Baptist, and we're going to discuss that later, probably in about 2 to 3 weeks. We're going to come back when we're done with the whole picture and come back and say, okay, let's get with the context of all of these other churches, now let's come back and try to understand the distinctives of what makes Baptist Baptist. But for right now, we're going to just try to get the overview. But there is question, and you'll see a little bit of this, of what is a Baptist. Some of you wonder that because you are a Baptist and you don't know what that means. We're going to get to that down the way here. There are really three main theories for where Baptists came from. The first one is called the English separatist theory. Remember, we talked last week that in that Church of England, there were three different reactions. One, there were the establishment folks that says, listen, hey, whatever happens is fine with me. I don't really care one way or the other. I'm going to just kind of move forward and maybe I'll get a job and all those kinds of things. The second one was there was a group of people that wanted to purify the church and say, this is the way the church is, but we're going to work really, really hard to make it as right as it can possibly be. And then there was the third group that said, listen, forget it. They're too messed up. We're separating. We're going our own way. And then we called that group the separatists. And so one of the theories of Baptist origins is called the English separatists. They were part of that group that said, you know what, forget it. We're gone. The second theory is what we would call the continental Anabaptists. We talked about them a little bit. This is Zwingli and Zurich. A little bit later, Menno Simons and the Mennonites. Remember, Anabaptist isn't just somebody I went to high school with, but it is just the idea of a rebaptizer. Someone who was baptized as an infant, and yet later in life they're baptized again. And one of the things that we said last week was that this is a really wide term because it's describing anyone that has been rebaptized. And in that circle of people who have been rebaptized, they have a lot of other features of who they are. And so this isn't a very precise term. It emphasizes this one area of baptism. And then there's a third category or a third theory that says Baptists always were. From the beginning of time, there have been Baptists. And so those are the three main theories, and we're going to talk a little bit about each one of those this evening. So let's start with the English separatist theory, the EST. I don't know if anybody calls it that, but I just did. The English separatist theory. Remember Henry VIII? You remember that whole story? That's how the Church of England left Rome, because of his deep theology. No, it was because he needed a divorce so that he could have a spare and an heir and a spare. And then you remember all the things that happened after Henry, and we went through that list of all the different monarchs, and then they went this way religiously, and then they went this way religiously, and then they went this way religiously, and the people all were required to be part of whatever church that king or queen established. And so the people in that church are swinging here and then here and then here and then here. And not only is that dizzying, but just like there's a pendulum, every once in a while there's a spot that you want to stop and say, no, this is where we want to be. And then you run right past it and run right past it. And some people are like, not only are we tired of swinging back and forth, but we actually know where we want to be. And we just keep missing it. And so there's the chaos that is following Henry as the required church keeps changing, and you're required to just follow along with what that church does. And then some folks says, yeah, no, we're not doing that anymore. We don't feel like we have to be compelled to come to the same conclusion to whatever you've come to the conclusion to believe. And so they became this group called the Separatists. Sometimes they're known as the Dissenters because they dissent from being part of the organized church. Sometimes they're called the Independents because they want to be. There you go. You got it in one. Now, one of the things that they want to do, and this is high on being a separatist, is that they want to disconnect the church from the state and the government. They want to disconnect from the church and so what's been happening, this isn't going to be super complicated, but what's been happening is there is this existence that is the church and the government, which happens to be the king or the state, depending on how, and this could be queen. It's all connected. It's one thing. And every time this changes, this has to change. And so what they want to do is they were to put a wall between these two things. They want to separate it. Now, some of you would recognize that this concept is the same concept that we talk about today sometimes as separation of church and state. So you've got church and government. Now, today, let me get to that in a moment. But what's happening here is that this is connected. And what's happening is this. The government is telling the church what to do, and so there is a desire to put a separation between the two. Now, sometimes we really are in favor of that, but this is just a little bit of an aside. Sometimes we're like, but we would like to do this. We would like church to have influence over government. And I hear that. But I'm going to tell you, as long as these two are connected, it's not a good situation. Because you can try to make the arrow go one way, but the arrow is going to go the other way a lot. And so one of the things is there is a strong place in health for a nation, for a people, and for a church, is that we don't want the arrow to go this way, even if we would like the arrow to go this way. There are flaws in the arrow going this way as well. And so the separatists said, wait a minute. You can change your mind on what kind of church we're going to be, but I don't have to go with you. And in fact, your control over this doesn't have to be over any of it. And so one of the things that the separatists are dealing with is that they want to disconnect the church from the state. The separatists, I get real emotional about the separation of church and state. see, here we go. The separatists also want to reject anything that is, here's the technical term, Catholicish or high church. They don't want clerical vestments. They don't want fancy robes in church. They don't even want the preacher to wear particular clothes as he goes through town. They don't want a lot of ornamentation in the worship service. They want what we would call a lower church rather than a high church. And so these separatists are saying, we don't want that. The spot on the pendulum that we like is back over here. And you guys can keep swinging. We're just going to go here. They are often reformed leaning. That means that they're connected and influenced by John Calvin. Remember, a lot of these folks get in trouble at home, so they go to Geneva where it's safe to be a Protestant, come under the influence of John Calvin, and then come back to where they've been from. And so England has a strong reformed leaning. So these folks are reformed in their theology in many ways, but they want an independent or congregational church government. No bishop, no presbytery. Remember, the Catholic Church is going to have bishops and archbishops and cardinals that kind of work their way down, all the way down from the Pope. The Church of England is going to have very similar structure. The only thing they did is that they changed the person at the top. John Calvin's structure of church government is that folks elect folks to represent them in a presbytery, but then the presbytery has authority back over the church. The separatists have an idea that's like, listen, every church on its own. Every church calls its own pastor. Every church makes its own decisions. Every church does its own church. Now, they don't really emphasize the idea of voting. And it's the same kind of language that we try to use here at Valley, that together we try to discern. But it is a combined, there's no authority outside of Valley telling us what to do. These churches say, listen, it's up to us. Every church has its own decision-making and authority. Choose your own pastor. Choose your own doctrine. Choose your own worship structure. Those are the marks of English separatism. Now, that doesn't mean that these churches are Baptist churches. We can kind of feel the drift toward us, but that doesn't cover everything. The earliest evidence of separatist churches in England are around the 1560s. Henry separates from the church in 1535. So by 1560, within 30 years, you start to have these separatist churches that are saying, you know what, we're going to just do ours. Here's one of the earliest quotes, and this is a really great quote, so I'll try to read it for you. Some London citizens of the lowest order, together with 4 or 5 ministers, remarkable neither for their judgment nor their learning. Now, I don't know whether he is saying that the congregation is not remarkable for their judgment or their learning, or it's the 4 or 5 ministers that are not remarkable for their learning. There's a good chance we're in this together, all right? Have openly separated from us, and sometimes in private houses. This is the question that you all had a few weeks ago. Is there anybody just doing church in a house? We're going to come back to that in just a moment. These London citizens of the lowest order, together with 4 or 5 ministers, remarkable neither for their judgment nor their learning, have openly separated from us, sometimes in their private houses, sometimes in the fields, occasionally even in ships moored on the side of the wharf or wherever you moor a ship kind of outside of jurisdiction. They have held their meetings and administered sacraments. Besides this, they have ordained ministers, elders, and deacons after their own way. Their ordination didn't come through the Church of England. They just picked their own ministers. Now, this is telling us about some of the early presence of separatist churches in 1560s. One of the things that I would note, kind of in a response to the question, well, didn't they just have people meeting in church already? For several reasons, I would say not often. This is one of this. This is a new story. If people had been doing house church for some time, this paragraph doesn't exist. This paragraph is saying, whoa, there's something weird going on now that hasn't gone on before, as a general societal trend. These churches often have to leave England because of the control over the churches is very concerning. And so they end up going to places like Holland that has a bit more freedom. The idea of religious freedom and your ability to choose your own church, your own doctrine, your own belief, your own church government scared the daylights out of kings. In fact, James the First, who, if I remember correctly, is Henry the Eighth, and then his son Edward the Sixth, and then his sister Mary the First, and then Elizabeth the Second, then James the First. So that kind of moves us that far into the journey. James the First has this statement where he says, when you have no bishop, you have no king. So the idea of saying we're going to get rid of bishops as an authority control in the church made him really nervous, because if you don't have the bishops to prop things up, you're probably going to get rid of the king next. Now, again, James is coming from Scotland, where they have a bunch of Presbyterians, where they got rid of the bishops, and that made him nervous. And so as he comes south to England and becomes king in England, he really doesn't like any idea of, if you lose the structure of hierarchy in church, you might lose the structure of hierarchy in government as well. Now, remember at one point in time they chopped the king's head off? And so they're like, no bishop, no king, deal, we'll take it. And they get rid of the bishop and they get rid of the king under Oliver Cromwell. But then after the end of that, they're like, you know what, we missed the king, and we're going to bring back the bishop. And so this idea of no bishop, no king is tied together. James is nervous that if you get rid of the bishop, you're going to get rid of the king. They decide, you know what? Sure, let's get rid of the king, let's get rid of the bishop. When they decide to bring back the king, they also re-emphasize the bishop. So all of this is shifting. And in that process, that's the reason why they care whether out in a field or in a ship or in your backyard you're having church on your own, because they feel it's going to destabilize the entire country. And it may cost them their gig as king, which, as gigs go, it's a pretty good gig when they're not chopping your head off. It's a pretty good gig. Have you seen some of the places where they live? I mean, they're some big places. People still go pay money to visit those places. So many separatist churches are leaving England to go to Holland because it's a safer place to publicly practice their religion. One of the early separatist churches splits in two, not because they have a fight, but because they're making too much noise. And so, like, you know what? We don't want to draw too much attention to ourselves. And so basically they do a church plant. And they're like, you know what? So that we don't draw too much attention to ourselves, you guys go this way, we'll go this way, and we can keep a lower profile. One of those churches, both sides actually split, and both of them end up in Holland, though not together because they split. One of those groups eventually becomes the Pilgrims of Thanksgiving fame out of that same church. The second group becomes the First Baptist Church to be organized. It came from the same original place. So if there's a reason why you eat a little extra on Thanksgiving, it's part of your roots. It's who you are. It goes way back. You cannot help it. It's just the nature of what it means to be Baptist, to eat a lot. That may be true. The The other half, the non-pilgrim side, is led by two men, two pastors named John Smith and Thomas Helwys. In 1609, they organize and become the first Baptist church in existence. There is a desire out of the separatists growing into this early Baptist church for all worship and faith to come from the heart and not from prescribed forms. They don't want a book of common prayer. They don't want to recite a creed. They want it to be free. They don't want to pray out of a book. They don't want to, they want to be completely free. And in fact, John Smith goes so far as this was wild to me. He doesn't want scripture read in church because the English translation of the Bible is from man and not directly from God. So they are so wanting this to come from the Spirit that anything, in fact, he has a quote here. Let's see if I can't pull this up real quick. He has a quote here that says, oh boy. We got a problem. Here, the quote. We're going in a circle now. You see, this is what happens when you use something that comes from man. John Smith would say, this is what you get. You bring in a book of common prayer, then you bring in a laptop, and the whole thing goes crazy. Sorry, John. Smith insisted that true worship must come from the heart, and thus reading out of the book of in time of worship is no part of spiritual worship, but rather the invention of the man of sin. Smith felt that spiritual worship would be compromised by use of any written helps, and he would allow no book before the eye in a time of worship. Do not look at a book. I mean, forget people looking at their phones during church. He's like, I don't even want you looking at a book during church. All right, can you all see the big one back there? Great. Okay, the primary issue of division here is baptism. I'm going to stand over here. The primary issue is baptism here, and that's the reason why this is our middle name. He emphasizes regenerate church membership. Now, that's a long phrase, but what that means is to belong to a church, you need to be a believer in Christ. Now, for those of us who are from this tradition, I mean, like, yeah, but if you go back to that time where you are baptized as an infant into the life of the church, then that means from the time that you are an infant, you are part of the life of that church, kind of regardless of what happens next. And the Baptists are saying, no, the only person who can be a member of a church, who can belong to the church, who are part of the body, is that you have to be in Christ before you can be in the body. And so that's their emphasis. Therefore, they reject infant baptism. So it doesn't actually start with we're against infant baptism. It starts with the only way to be part of the church is to be a person who is in Christ yourself. And so an event that occurs in your life at this early age does not identify you as a member of the church. This gets a little bit further because it also says that any baptism that was performed by a false church, Catholic or the Church of England, doesn't count. So who does that leave needing to be baptized? Everybody. And so now you have an entire congregation that are going to be baptized, which is as we said before, is a really strange looking thing. If the only people that you've ever seen being baptized are infants, look around this room and you start seeing each other being baptized. That is a wild thing that has never been seen before. Baptism was for believers only. Just in case this comes up in a crossword puzzle, there's two fancy words for this. One is called pedobaptism. It's the same word we get pediatrician. It's littles. So if you believe in pedobaptism, that is, you are baptized as a little. The other word is credo baptism, and credo is the word for creed. This is what I believe. So Baptists switched from being pedobaptists, baptizing of infants, to credo Baptists. This is what I believe. I mention that because I like the idea of that credo. This is what I believe. You don't have to ever use that phrase, but it's there. Baptism was initially by pouring and not by immersion. The big step forward was who was getting baptized, not how they were getting baptized. We'll talk about that down the road. But to begin with, the first step was who's baptized, not how they're baptized. As you know, our church practices baptism by immersion for believers. At this point in time, it's just the candidate, not the process. And so they're probably pouring water over the candidate. The first baptism faced a really interesting question, and it's a succession question. If you're the first people that you know that are practicing believers' baptism, who gets to do the baptism? And the desire is we should find someone who has also been baptized as a believer. And they don't have anybody. So John Smith baptized himself. And then John Smith baptizes Thomas Helwys, and then they baptize the rest of the congregation. This becomes actually a significant issue for the church, this question of succession, this connectedness of baptism. In fact, oh wait, that's a previous fact. I don't know where we are. Baptism becomes a significant succession question. Man, I wonder where the rest of these notes are. John, I think we're going to come up to the slide in just a minute, but John Smith actually is only a Baptist for a matter of months because he has second thoughts. He has second thought. I think I know where the slide is. It's coming in a minute. But he has second thoughts about the fact that he baptized himself. And he believes that I should have had somebody baptize me. Now, I'll be honest with you. I think Helwys could have baptized Smith and Smith could have baptized Helwys. This idea that we have to have this unbroken succession is introducing another layer to our salvation. How are we saved? By grace through faith alone, plus being baptized by somebody else who's already been baptized. That's not in the text. And so while we have this idea, it would be nice to pass this along like a baton from person to person to person. That's an unnecessary piece of the puzzle that is being held on to. It is Christ that saves us. It is that story. And baptism is a profession of that salvation. It doesn't matter who baptizes who. It is the profession. It is not a question that your baptism can be invalidated because it was performed by the wrong person. Now, this matters. Let's say that I baptize you and I do something stupid in my ministry and in my life. Let's say I walk away from the faith. I'm not going to. But does that mean that your baptism is no longer valid? because something happened inside of me. No, your baptism was your testimony of your transformation. But going back to the beginning, they were anxious about this question. We've got to find someone who's done it so that they can pass it on to person. Quick side story that we're not going to spend a lot of time here for lots of reasons, but there actually is a Second Baptist origin story, okay? And that is that the group that we're talking about here from 1609 is what we call the General Baptist. It doesn't mean they outrank somebody else, but they're the General Baptists, and this is what it means. The General Baptists were not Reformed. They were not under the influence of John Calvin. And one of Calvin's distinctions is that Christ only died for some people. The General Baptists believe that Christ died for the general population. Now, every person needs to respond, but he died for everyone. There's another group that forms also out of English separatism, but in a different place about 20 years later, that are called the Particular Baptists. And they are under the influence, they are influenced by John Calvin, including the doctrine that Jesus only died for a particular group of people. The people that have been already preordained to be the people who come to Christ. And that idea is that we don't want to waste the blood of Christ on people who aren't necessarily been chosen to be saved anyways. That's where the idea of Particular Baptists come from. Now, to be clear, the teaching of Valley Baptist Church, I believe the teaching of Scripture, the conviction of your pastor, is that if you have ever drawn a breath, you are qualified for the grace and the saving work of Jesus. Every person who has ever drawn a breath is qualified for the saving work of Christ. Now, those of you who are been in Baptist churches for a while know the Baptist churches have been arguing between this question of whether we're Reformed or not Reformed your entire life. It's not just your entire life. We have two different branches of Baptist life. One of them says we're General Baptist, we're not Reformed. There's another one that says we're Particular Baptist, we are Reformed. And they argue about, well, which one's the real one? Well, the truth is, both of them exist. Now, I believe that one of them is right. But you cannot say that true Baptists are this one or this one. It's all in the same family tree. We're there. And we've had to try to figure out how to work together ever since. General Baptists came first. Particular Baptists grew larger initially once they kind of caught up. And then it's just kind of been depending on where you go, depending on which church you go to. And then sometimes it depends on which Sunday school class you go to. But the teaching of Valley Baptist Church is that we're on the general side. Now listen, even the General Baptists here don't have it 100% right, because many of these folks thought that you got saved, you could also get unsaved. And we don't buy that either. So we're not really purely General Baptists either. And again, this is one of those things, remember I said we're not going to cover everything that there is to cover. This is one of the things that I'm really trying not to cover tonight. But this idea here, that each one of these sides says, here's a list of 5 things these folks believe, and here's 5 things that these folks believe. Here's the truth. They're both right in places, and they're both wrong in places. And Scripture teaches elements that both of them catch. And so we're not either one of those. We're not here and we're not here. And people say that's not possible. I can tell you, I believe that Jesus died for every single person, and I also believe that once you're saved, He keeps you saved. And so that means sometimes we use the term here Arminian, and sometimes people say to me, well, if you're not Reformed, you're Arminian. I'm like, no, I happen to know myself. I'm not Arminian. because I don't believe that Jesus changes his mind about who he saved. So again, we're not talking about that. We're not spending any time, but it is part of the story, and you're supposed to know that. So I need you to see that, and I need you to understand that, and I need you to understand that when you go to a church that is in conflict over it, it's old, and it's there. Okay, and don't let anyone tell you that their side is the true ones. All right, the Continental Anabaptist theory. This is the slide that I was trying to figure out. This is really a matter of degrees. How much do you measure the influence of the Anabaptists in Holland? Really, if you look at those early Baptists, they are the product of the English separatists. They come out of England. It's the English separatism. But when they get to Holland, they also happen to be some Anabaptists that are already there. And in fact, Smith soon leaves the Baptist church to seek baptism from an Anabaptist, partly because of the succession question. Now, they put him on probation because they're like, dude, you've been part of 3 different churches in the last 6 months, and so we're going to have to wait and see, and he dies while they're waiting to see. So the founder of the Baptist church actually dies without a church. It happens sometimes. But it really was this question. He left because he felt bad that he had baptized himself. And the seriousness with they took all of it is that it was a process of months before they would determine whether they would baptize him. So everything in those days was really drawn out and really serious. Let's see here. Oh, there's one other. We didn't spend hardly any time on the Continental Anabaptist theory because I think that most of it is English separatism, with the reality that there were these Anabaptists around that were emphasizing rebaptism. And so that probably had some influence. Whether it's 15% influence, it's a minority influence. There is some influence, but the majority is this English separatism. So here's the other theory. You know, Susan and I visited the Bronze Fawns down in Milwaukee not too long ago. The other theory is that there is an unbroken succession of Baptist churches from the beginning of Christianity. No. Now, I will tell you that for many people, if you've ever taken a course in Baptist history, this is what you've been taught. There was a turn of the century, and I don't even mean this century, I mean the last century, and maybe even the one before that, late 1800s, where this was a very, very popular theory. I believe, and they wouldn't want to hear this, but I believe it's some Catholic envy. The Catholics say we have an unbroken history that goes all the way back to Peter, the first pope. And Baptists are like, no, you don't. We have an unbroken history, and we say we go all the way back to John the Baptist, who is further back than Peter. So take that. And we have this unbroken because there is this need that says we've got to be able to have this unbroken chain, which I'm telling you isn't necessary to our theology in any way. In fact, it is an extra confusing piece that does not contribute to our theology. It kind of messes with our theology, but it's because we were insecure and we wanted to keep up with everybody else's succession stories. So here's a couple reasons why. The idea is that there is an unbroken chain, but the answer to that is no, because of the geography. They give a list of there's this group, and then there's this group, and there's this group, and there's this group, and there's this group. But those groups never spoke to each other. They weren't close enough to have any influence on one another. Some of them are in Germany. Some of them are over here. Some of them are over here. Some of them are over here. And so geographically, that they would have done fine in COVID. nobody would have, they had plenty of separation from each other. They wouldn't have even had to wear masks. They were so far apart from each other. Nobody was going to catch Baptist from each other. That was pretty good. Secondly, it doesn't work on chronological grounds. Not only are there geographic gaps between this, there's time gaps. It's not an unbroken chain because you have sometimes centuries between some of these groups. Yes, are there some groups? We're going to get to the groups in just a minute. Are there some groups out there that are what we would call Catholic nonconformist? Yes. But they're not contagious to each other, and they're not connected chronologically either. There are chunks of time where they disappear. And then finally, no on doctrinal grounds. Basically, what happens is that they adopt any group that stands in opposition to the Roman Catholic Church. So any group that stands against the Catholic Church is adopted as Baptist. And some of the folks that they adopt as Baptist, they're not even fully Orthodox. There's a group that's very well known as the Montanists, and the Montanists get kind of out of shape. But they are a key linchpin because they're an early group of nonconformists to the Catholic Church, so they get adopted. One of the groups that they talk about is the Lollards. Now, this jumps ahead into the 1200s. This is John Wycliffe's people, and John Wycliffe's people had some things that would be in common with us and Protestants, but man, they had an awful lot of things that were in common with Catholicism still. If you met a Lollard and they applied for membership to our church, we're like, no, you don't believe what we believe. Now, did they stand in opposition to the Catholic Church in some places? Yes. Did John Wycliffe get dug up, burned at the stake, and sprinkled on the river? Yes. But that doesn't make him a Baptist. And so it's a no on doctrinal grounds. They weren't connected geographically, chronologically, and they weren't connected doctrinally. They were a bunch of nonconformist Catholic against the Catholic Church. So here's my summary. Not every animal with a horn is a unicorn. Just because it has a horn doesn't make it a unicorn. In fact, none of the animals with a horn are likely to be a unicorn. And I would tell you that when you go back in history to this group, you may be able to identify a proto-Protestant church. You may be able to identify a group that was a little bit more biblically grounded than the contrasting Catholic Church of its time. But you can't call it Baptist. You can't call it Baptist. These are non-conforming churches. And the reason why this is presented is because we want to have this succession. There's been some famous people that have presented this. Several of you have mentioned to me that you've studied the Trail of Blood. That's the book that really put this thing on the map in the late 1800s. There's another guy that wrote a lot to defend this in the late 1800s. His name is John T. Christian. I know the name of John T. Christian because the library at the seminary that I attended was the John T. Christian Library. I didn't realize that connection existed. The most famous Baptist of all time, not Jimmy Carter, but the most famous Baptist of all time, Spurgeon, held to this position and taught this position. So when you have that, boy, I mean, if Spurgeon said it, how am I going to argue with that? Well, I just did. These reasons and this idea of succession is unnecessary. All right, let's see here. Denominations in the New World, let's see if we can't fly through this. we begin to move to the United States, or well, to America, and the denominational issues between Protestants or separatists and Puritans and establishment folks also comes over to each one of the colonies. And part of the reason why the United America becomes a melting pot is because you had different parts of this group represented. Virginia, the first of the colonies, is a royal chartered colony that is 100% Anglican. The most famous Virginian, George Washington, was an incredibly involved Anglican person. Now, they quit going by Church of England during the war and after, but it's a high establishment person. George Washington was a high establishment person. Massachusetts has a couple of different pieces. Separatists, the ones we talked about just a few minutes ago, went to the Plymouth colony. The rest of it was Puritan. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was the Puritan group that comes to Massachusetts because really they come about the time that there's the restoration of the royalty. And it's like, oh, we don't like what's happening here. And so they get permission to come here, and they're out of everybody's hair. And so Massachusetts has these strains. Maryland comes, and basically it's a Catholic colony that comes with folks that are coming for religious freedom because they can't practice Catholicism back in England. Pennsylvania, we didn't really talk about this a lot, but Quakers are a form of separatists, a very unique form of separatists, but they really emphasize religious freedom. And the king owes a debt to William Penn, pays him off in this property that nobody really wants, and it's Penn's Wood, Pennsylvania. And so Pennsylvania becomes one of the great hearts of religious freedom in America because of its Quaker roots. Rhode Island, well, it started by a Baptist because Roger Williams is in the Massachusetts Bay Colony preaching against infant baptism. He is in prison, beaten, and kicked out. And then he leaves and starts his own place in a place called Providence. He calls it Providence, good spiritual name. And he goes back to England, gets permission to start a new colony called Rhode Island. And he grants religious freedom to everyone that is in Rhode Island. It's another place of great religious freedom. So the Quakers don't make Pennsylvania Quaker, they give it religious freedom. Roger Williams doesn't make Rhode Island Baptist, he has religious freedom for everyone. Lutherans and Catholics would grow through the 19th century immigration that comes from the more Catholic and Lutheran parts of the old world. Right now, so much of the immigration is coming from England, which isn't Catholic or Lutheran. And so you're getting these branches of denominations. But in the 1800s and the middle 1800s, that's where most of your relatives came over and came to places like Milwaukee and Chicago and the Midwest. And we have the Catholics and the Lutherans that come at a later wave, and the influence grows at that time. Oh, yeah, piece of cake. One more. Methodists. Methodists are a little bit hard to measure in terms of time. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Started on a university campus, the Oxford Holy Club. I'm pretty sure they have one of this at UW-Madison, a Holy Club. They get together and pray a lot. Includes folks like John Wesley, his brother Charles Wesley, and then a buddy of theirs named George Whitefield. They're in college at university, and they have a deep desire, like, we've got to do more. We've got to be fervent in our faith. We have got to be serious about this. And they challenged each other literally to live as close to holy as they possibly could. Now, all of them, particularly the Wesley brothers, still kind of struggle. In fact, both Wesley brothers come to Georgia as missionaries, but they're not even sure that they're saved. And as they come back from Georgia, they are still struggling with their faith. John Wesley meets some folks called Moravians that are the descendants of John Huss. one of the early forerunners of the Reformation, and they say, hey, you should read some Luther stuff. They start to read some Luther stuff. He goes by a church one Sunday night in London and comes in and hears a sermon from Romans chapter 1 and feels his heart strangely warmed, and he understands that to be his salvation experience. It becomes a movement inside of the Church of England to promote a method. They're the Methodists, a method for how to live a holy life. They were like, listen, we're part of the Church of England, but we just want to be more serious about our faith. But they were considered to be crazy young people that just were acting weird. And so when they went to try to get placements as ministers in traditional churches, the churches very often really kind of closed the door to Wesley and to Wesley's followers. And so they're like, you know what? We'll just go preach in some fields and in some town squares. And Wesley just preached everywhere. And this is a really big deal because he now takes faith and the gospel outside of the doors of the church. This is an incredibly modern role. The other thing that he does is he starts small groups and says, listen, if we were to study the Word of God and challenge each other in a group, boy, that'd be really beneficial for your spiritual life. Sometimes we refer to Sunday school, and Sunday school actually started as a children's ministry, literally to educate uneducated kids with the gospel, but also literal teaching. And so that comes a little bit later, but in terms of adults gathering together in groups to be mentored and taught and to discuss the Word, Wesley is the guy that invents small group ministry. Way back then, Charles Wesley, back when we had hymnals, he wrote about a third of that hymnal. Most of what you sing at Christmas is Charles Wesley. This is an incredibly influential movement inside of the church today. What happens is they're Puritan in mindset in terms of we want to purify the church, but they're non-Puritan in theology. Most of the Puritans were Reformed or Calvinists. They're not. They're actually for real on that Arminian side. One of the things that would be a pretty common teaching in a Methodist church is that you can lose your salvation. You can cease to be a follower of Christ. So Puritan in mindset, let's purify the church. Non-Puritan in theology because they're not Reformed. That's what I just said. They are responsible for incredible growth and influence of churches in England and America. Huge growth. But eventually there's no longer home for them in the Church of England. Partly because they grow in size, they grow in energy, and the Church of England doesn't really figure out how to embrace them or receive them. And in fact, the Church of England, in its kind of stiff formality, the Church of England would probably prefer, let's not get too excited about anything. Let's just kind of keep it down the middle. No, nobody get crazy here. Let's keep it in order. That's a primary goal of an Anglican position, is let's keep it in order. No wild swings anymore. Let's keep it in order. And so there really was kind of a stiff arm to this movement inside of the Church of England, to the point that they're like, they wouldn't ordain someone that was part of this Methodist society. And so some folks John Wesley started to ordain people inside of that society that the Church of England wouldn't ordain. His brother Charles says, no, we shouldn't do that. But eventually, I think both of them died as members of the Church of England, but not long after that, they became Methodist as a separate church. That's why it's hard to put a date on this. Their movement at Oxford is 1729. John Wesley writes the rules of what it means to be a Methodist in 1746. And then Wesley dies in the 1770s, I think, or 1767. I don't remember. And they're still actually members of the Church of England. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint when Methodists ceased to be part of the Church of England, and they're their own church. Let's take a look at where we are. You ready? Here's our map. The Orthodox Church, Lutheran Church, Zwingli, the Anabaptists coming out of there, Mennonites, Brethren churches, the Church of England in 1534, Calvin and Reformed churches. Again, that date's a little bit fuzzy, but Presbyterians come out of there. And now we're back up there to the Church of England in 1609. Out come the Baptists. The Methodists are sometime in the 18th century, and I've got the order wrong here, but the Quakers are 1647 back there. All right, we have 3 minutes for questions.